Well, thank you all who are here attending, taking part in this virtual discussion. And I emphasize discussion because we will, in addition to hearing from our panelists, be opening up later for questions, as Ryan mentioned. And we hope by the end you'll have some useful insight into how press violations are affecting the work of environmental journalists, and maybe how we might address that. I'd like to, by the way, thank our host organizations, the Freedom of the Press Foundation and the Society of Environmental Journalists. Full disclosure, I'm fortunate enough to be deeply connected with both of them. I'm a deputy editor here at FPF and a consulting publications director at SEJ. So nice to wear both hats at once. I'll briefly introduce our panelists. Thank you for taking time out of your schedule to talk about these issues and how they affect you directly and our work more generally. My colleague there, Caitlin Vogus, who's Deputy Director of Advocacy at FPF, Hallie Parker, who covers the environment for WWNO in New Orleans and is a board member for SEJ, and Carlos Barrios Polanco, who's a freelance environmental writer and journalist, a photojournalist rather, from Puerto Rico, specializing in climate and conflict. There is further bio information and links on the invite, and maybe we can add those back in later into the chat as well if you want to learn more about these talented individuals. So in a few minutes, we'll hear from each of them about their experiences, their insights. I've asked them to keep remarks to about 5 minutes or so that we do have plenty of time for discussion at the end. Start thinking about questions you might want to ask now. Submit them to the Q&A function, and we'll be watching that carefully for good questions to ask later. Before I have the speakers share their thoughts, I'd like to just offer a few comments myself, moderator's prerogative, to start thinking about the topic for today. Just a reminder, quote, the intersections of press freedom and the environment. First of all, that's, you may be aware, inspired by, the focus is inspired by the World Press Freedom Day theme this year. That day is tomorrow. This year, it's dedicated not just to the importance of journalism and freedom of expression, but journalism in the context of the global environmental crisis. Environmental challenges, which I have covered myself for quite a long time, climate change and many others, these confront communities around the world and in the US. And for journalists, that means there's a great urgency on our part in covering these topics thoughtfully, courageously, constantly. Pick your adjective. But that means that obstacles to that work, like ones we'll talk about today, are all the more worrying. And that's partly why we're here today. We will be focusing for the discussion mostly on U.S. environmental reporting, press freedom issues. But obviously we have to acknowledge that these issues are not constrained by national borders, and we'll touch a bit on the international angle later. But just in case you're wondering, it's primarily U.S. focused today. I want to also offer a few data points from the U.S. to set the stage for our discussions. And thank you for this slide there. You can see, first of all, the source. Well, let me just say the data, and I won't drown you in numbers here, but the data really is primarily in service of the actual experiences that journalists are having on the ground. So we'll hear personal stories today, but I wanted to just contextualize those experiences a bit. The source of the data that I'll use today is the U.S. Press Freedom Tracker. That's a project of the FPF. It's an open source database on press freedom incidents in the US, things like assaults and arrests and equipment seizures, subpoenas, and more. And since launching in 2017, the unfortunate number is nearly 2,000 press violations have been tracked by the project. You can see there some of the categories and geographic locations. We also tag various kinds of incidents, like particular contexts like protest or Israel-Gaza war. And one such tag is environmentalism. That tag is when the press violation takes place in response to reporting on environmental issues, climate change, pipeline protests, etc. So you could see that graphic now. That captures the environmentalism incidents when reporters are covering those topics. Just to note, there's a color key at the top. So as I talk through, you can match, but I'll try to reference the color as well to make it easier. So since launch, we've tracked 36 press freedom violations involving coverage of environmental stories from the early days to as recently as this January. I'll just say that this is not necessarily the complete number, mostly because some incidents are not reported by journalists or their news organizations. Also, there's some overlap in some of these cases with multiple violations. So an arrest and an assault, for example. The single largest category here, the sort of green, dark green, is arrests and criminal charges with 17 violations in all. Nearly all are from covering protests. We had about a dozen several years ago from pipeline protests, one last November from a climate protest, and several recently from protests, coverage of protests outside the police training facility in Atlanta, known as Cop City. And that we'll hear more about that when we invite Carlos to speak. By the way, of crossover of these categories, for instance, with arrests is often a seizure of equipment, whether it's cameras, phones, computers as well. So nearly half of those arrests involve some search and seizure. The next largest category is assaults. You can see the sort of dark red, rust red. I'm not very good at my color designations, forgive me. There are 11 incidents there. Nearly half of those involve law enforcement and include things like, tear gas, crowd control munitions, direct physical assaults. There's an equal number by private individuals, including at protests. There's also a handful of legal orders. That's the yellow column on the far right. Things like subpoenas, a prior restraint, and we'll be hearing a case involving such a legal dispute, a legal violation from Hallie. She talks later about journalists and news outlets in Louisiana. We'll also hear about that too from Caitlin, the kinds of legal obstacles facing journalists. So I just wanted to provide that baseline of numbers. You can see, you can visit the tracker. We'll share some of these links in the chat if we haven't already, so you can look at them individually and read about the individual cases. But I'd like to pass the mic now over, the virtual mic over to Carlos to discuss his experiences covering the Atlanta protests so we can make these numbers real and human. So please go ahead, Carlos.
Well, hi, everybody. Thank you for having me to talk about my experience with the Stop Cop City movement in Atlanta. First, I want to say that a lot of the experiences of reporters who've covered the movement from the very beginning until now relate or are similar to other interactions that journalists have had with similar environmental movements across the United States, right? A lot of the things that we've seen during the Stop Cop City movement and what has happened to journalists has happened during pipeline protests and other sort of environmental protests, right? I was there twice in 2023 to report on Weeks of Action. The first time that I was there, I saw kind of a journalist going to be handcuffed, but I guess the the guy's commanding officer stopped him. This picture that was just put up is from the second time I was there during the Block Cop City Day of Action, where activists were planning to walk to the site where they're building the police training center called Cop City, not the official name, but that's what people call it colloquially. And as journalists and activists were walking to the site, when activists were trying to peacefully continue walking down the road, they were stopped by police. And that's when the first tear gas canister went off. It's what either the first or one of the first tear gas canisters was at the feet of the press corps. And here you can see my friend Matt kind of walking away from that first tear gas cloud that came out of us. And I want to give like a warning to not do something that I did, which I had my gas mask on my head but not covering my face, and then I put it on after. So I kind of essentially gassed myself because of the gas trap and the gas mask. Don't do that. Be smarter than I was. Always be prepared. But essentially, after this first tear gas canister was thrown, people went everywhere. In the second picture, you can see what happened after a group of the press was kind of pushed away from the main group of protesters that you can kind of see in the background. This is a journalist. I don't remember their name, but the cop, you can see, had a hand on their back and was telling them, "Hey, you can't record here. You need to keep moving away." And police and security forces kept telling us to move away from where the massive protesters were, and it was a little angry at the time, but also quite funny how officers and cops themselves couldn't decide where they wanted us to go, because you had some telling us go back, you had others telling us go forward to meet the group, and it kind of ended up in a standstill, us trying to kind of assert ourselves. We're doing our jobs. This is here a cop kind of like pushing me, telling me, "Hey, keep moving." Um, It's very funny because they couldn't even the cops couldn't decide what they wanted us to do. This is I believe a GSP officer telling me to move back or we're gonna be arrested. This is, you can see the zip tie cuffs there. Um, but right, it was very, I don't know, the word I always use is funny, but it's not good. Them not being able to kind of decide what they wanted us to do as they were infringing on our right to do our jobs and report on um, this protest that was going on. About 10 of us were pushed away from the crowd, unable to report until about 30 minutes later. We were told to come back and meet most of the protesters, which had retreated from the area. This is a picture of two journalists recording the police kind of in the space between the police riot line and the space where activists were. This is kind of after we were told we were able to meet the group again. And um, I was like pushed, I was tear gassed. Sadly, not an uncommon thing that you experience as a reporter these days. And it's emblematic of the way that press are treated throughout the United States and the world, right? We're seeing a lot of the calling of press freedoms, especially with the current protests going on at universities across the United States. And just I add one little thing: environmental journalists are usually stopped by either state or non-state actors who have a vested investment in whatever um, environmental journalists are covering, and they often don't allow them to do their jobs because they want to obscure what's going on.
Thank you, Carlos. And I again encourage folks to think about questions they might have for Carlos to share in the Q&A area later on about this. But your last point is a good one, especially as we watch coverage of police actions just in recent days, but certainly in incidents like this, that in effect the police are stopping the coverage of the police and what they're
Mm.
doing. So talk about a vested interest. I think that's clearly an issue here. I mean, I think one thing to note, which may be obvious, but we've seen with the tracker Press Freedom Tracker's work is that, these violations are certainly they're not limited to environmental protests, but protests in general are a major source of these kinds of violations. And I think Caitlin will talk a bit about this later, but just to put that into context, for instance, in the social justice protests in 2020, and the 3 months after George Floyd's murder, the tracker documented 133 arrests and over 600 physical attacks, with like rubber bullets and that kind of thing. And we're seeing this now again in recent months with the treatment of journalists at the pro-Palestinian protests, like at campuses in the last few days. Over the months, we've already tracked 14 arrests and 10 assaults. And it's not going away. However, these kinds of dramatic stories, like we saw with Carlos, and particularly those great, not great images, but very effective, powerful images. That's not the whole story of press violations, right? There's also this chipping away of press access, for instance, through legal means. And I wanted to pass the baton over to Hallie to talk about the dispute that she was embroiled in down in Louisiana, and then we'll continue that thread too with Caitlin. But please go ahead, Hallie.
Yeah, fortunately, I've never been in Carlos's position of being tear gassed, nor do I want to be. So hopefully we can make some changes with all of this. So with my story, it kind of starts all the way back in 2022. That was when the Environmental Protection Agency launched this historic civil rights investigation into the permitting and how the state was handling different potential violations of constitutional rights for Black communities living in the industrial corridor along the Mississippi River down here. And so it was like a very big deal. I had been one of the reporters following this development pretty closely. I did several pieces on it, did a podcast episode about it. And then last year, the EPA suddenly just dropped the investigation after the state of Louisiana ended up suing the agency over their investigation. And so when the EPA dropped it, they didn't reach a conclusion. They just closed the case. So, throughout this time during the investigation, I'm just doing my reporter thing. I'm reaching out to the EPA for comment at different points in time. They're often saying they can't comment because it's an ongoing investigation. But there was one point where I was able to get like a background interview with them. So, we're just having different interactions, very normal reporter agency communication. And then earlier this year in January, I actually get this DM on Twitter from another reporter who sends me this screenshot of a public records request that the EPA was sent from the Louisiana Attorney General last June. And it actually had my name on it. And I was very surprised to see that. This public records request had a list of, I think it was like almost a dozen reporters. And basically, the state was accusing the EPA of illegally leaking information to reporters that were covering this civil rights investigation. And my first reaction, it's funny that Carlos had described his very terrible experience as funny, because my first reaction to this was very much like, I'm scoffing, like, whatever, why, what does this matter? Why would they even decide to do this? It's not like they were going to get anything, at least in my mind. Plus, I also saw the request and they didn't even affiliate me with the correct news outlet at the time. They had me with the Times-Picayune. I hadn't worked for the Times-Picayune ever since the investigation started. So that was kind of strange. I was just like, who did this research in terms of filing this request? But, even though it seemed silly, I increasingly got a little bit more worried about it just because of, the implications of it. It makes you start trying to think and like retrace all the steps that you took, like that could have fallen under that FOIA, and that can start to get a little intimidating. And I still think that state agencies definitely have the right to request public records, but several press freedom and watchdog groups have pointed out that the law isn't really intended for agencies to use that law to monitor the activities of journalists. And really, it can grow from there because the same attorney general for Louisiana that decided to file this FOIA request to the EPA is now looking to completely strip down the public records request law in Louisiana and just basically have most of the public records from the state blocked behind a wall and unable to get to. So it's kind of like an underlying sinister thing, but less so in the open and also a little bit less physically violent, obviously. Less physically violent than what Carlos went through, a different type of like quiet violence, I think. So yeah.
Yeah, I think quiet violence is a great, you should trademark that term because, and as we'll hear, from Caitlin, I'm sure in a minute, there are many such actions, and they're not as visible, and yet they do keep reporters from doing their work or cause them to look over their shoulders in ways that are chilling.
Yeah, and I was going to add too, like in both of these instances, it's of course press freedom that's under attack, but when you attack press freedom, you're attacking the freedom of everybody, all the residents, the citizens that you're serving. It's an attack on the First Amendment that everyone should have a right to. And journalists aren't the only ones that can file public records requests, right? That's a right that everyone has.
Yeah, yeah. And also, back to the kind of theme discussion, World Press Freedom Day, the idea that, these are the kinds of stories that people, listeners, readers, viewers, they need to hear. They have rights as well, to hear this information or see or read it, and that's being blocked in many cases as well. But it's a good transition, I think, for Caitlin. Was a First Amendment expert, a legal expert. As you're listening to these accounts and what you've seen in your work, how do we react? I mean, this is a very broad range of things, from physical assaults to these subtle legal maneuvers. What are the threats here that we should be paying attention to? And
well, thanks, Adam. And first, I'd just like to
Sure.
say thanks for hosting this conversation, and to SEJ for co-sponsoring it, as well as to Carlos and Hallie and all the environmental journalists for the work that they're doing, because it is keeping the public informed and protecting our freedoms. I guess my response to their stories is that they are disturbing, but unfortunately not surprising, which is sad as someone who cares about the First Amendment and cares about press freedom, that our country has come to a place where these kinds of attacks on journalists, whether they're environmental journalists or other types of journalists, are more and more routine. And one thing I think we have to keep in mind is that even as they're happening more often, we can't become numb to them, and we can't just come to accept them. We have to speak out against them, and we have to fight back. And so that's why it's so important that journalists like Carlos and Hallie are drawing attention to the attacks that they're facing. On Carlos's story, as you mentioned, Adam, one of the things we know from the data collected at the US Press Freedom Tracker is that protests are one of the most dangerous places for journalists when it comes to things like arrests or attacks. And you mentioned the pro-Palestinian demonstrations that have been going on and the dozens of incidences that the Press Freedom Tracker has documented so far and is continuing to document as incidents roll in from, even last night on college campuses. We're having more come in and having to add those to the database. So it's an issue that journalists are facing even beyond the environmental realm, but certainly it's one very concerning, I think, for environmental journalists, because we see so many protests these days over climate change and over environmental issues. And so environmental journalists are almost becoming, protest journalists, covering protests all the time. And that means that they are at greater risk of being arrested or assaulted or detained. And that's something that they need to think about before they go out and cover protests. So groups like ours, Freedom of the Press Foundation, as well as the Committee to Protect Journalists and the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press, have various guides for journalists who are covering protests. And I would certainly encourage environmental journalists to seek those out and to make sure they're familiar with their legal rights, but also their practical tips of what they should be doing, like Carlos was mentioning with the gas mask. All those things they need to be thinking about to keep themselves safe. And when it comes to legal rights and covering protests, journalists do have a right to be present, a First Amendment right to be present in public and record activity at protests, including recording police. But unfortunately, that legal right doesn't always get respected. And police do still arrest journalists at protests. And that stops them from reporting the news, even if the charges are ultimately dropped, which they often are, but not always. Just having the journalist be arrested or detained or tear gassed and pushed away means that they can't get the story and they can't inform the public. And so it's a really harmful First Amendment violation, even if a journalist doesn't go to jail. That doesn't mean that it's okay if the police have arrested them at a protest. I think the other thing I would note is that we've recently seen some development in the law where courts have recognized that even when the police tell protesters that they have to disperse, journalists are free to remain and to continue to document. And that's not been recognized by every court around the country. So it's still in flux. And, depending on where you are, you may not have that legal recognition yet. But there is a growing recognition that the time when police are moving in on a protest and arresting protesters is actually when you need the press there the most. And so if you tell the press that they have to disperse with the protesters, that means that they're not going to be able to gather really newsworthy information. And some courts, as well as the Federal Department of Justice, have recognized that reporters do have a right to stay at a protest and to continue to report, even when the police have told protesters that they have to leave. And then you also mentioned the issue around seizure of devices, Adam, which can happen at protests as well. And I think one thing that environmental journalists should be aware of is, number one, the digital security of their devices. Will their information be locked down and secure in the event that police do seize a device at a protest? And again, FPF has some resources on digital security for journalists. But also there's a law that is supposed to protect journalists from having their devices seized by police and searched, which is called the Privacy Protection Act of 1980. The problem is, again, police don't always know about that law. And so as a journalist, you almost have to become a legal advocate on the ground and make sure that you are armed with the knowledge to at least say to the police, you're breaking the law right now by seizing my device. Do you know about the Privacy Protection Act? So we've even recommended that journalists, carry a copy of it on them or keep it in their newsroom and try to push back when their devices get seized. And then I know we only have a few minutes, so I don't want to take up more time, but Hallie's incident certainly shows that FOIA can also be weaponized against journalists. And it can be an extremely powerful tool for environmental journalists who are trying to report, because the government has a lot of valuable records about work they're doing on the environment and environmental impacts. But what happened to Hallie is really an example of a government actor using FOIA to try to bully and intimidate journalists. And that should never happen. And that's not what the law is designed for. And as she mentioned, it's incredibly ironic that Louisiana is now trying to crack down on its own public records law and stymie reporters' access to information. So I'd say what's good for the goose is what's good for the gander, and they shouldn't be able to stop reporters from finding out what's happening in Louisiana. At the same time, they're trying to use FOIA to dig up what they see as dirt about reporters when it's really just reporters doing their jobs and doing nothing wrong. And the very last thing that I wanted to mention is that another thing I think environmental journalists should be thinking about is protection of their sources. So we know that environmental journalists often have to rely on whistleblowers, for example, who might be revealing wrongdoing by a corporation or by government when it comes to the environment. Or maybe they're talking to protesters or protest organizers who can't be named publicly because they're afraid of retaliation or legal risks if they are. And so environmental journalists need to be able to protect their sources and keep them confidential so that they'll continue to talk with them. And one thing I would encourage reporters to check out is a federal bill known as the Press Act, which would create a federal reporter shield law that would allow journalists to keep their sources confidential when they're in federal court. There are already protections at the state level. Most states recognize a reporter's privilege or have one written into state law, but there's currently no protection in federal law other than what the First Amendment provides. And so the Press Act would be a really important provision that would help environmental journalists protect their sources and make sure that they can keep reporting on these environmental issues that they really need whistleblowers and other sources to tell them about. So that's kind of the legal landscape. And again, I have a lot of respect for Carlos and Hallie and all the work that these reporters are doing, because as we were discussing, this is our freedom that they're protecting and our right to know about what's happening in the environment.
That's great. Caitlin, thank you so much. This is a good, really good overview. And thank you also to Hallie and to Carlos too for opening those conversations. very quickly, we're starting to get a couple of questions in the Q&A, so keep those coming in. We'll open up in a few minutes. There was a question, or a comment really, from Holly Jonas to the in the chat about sharing a link about the of this to Caitlin about the court case you mentioned regarding the right to remain for journalists. So if you know something, you can put it, I think, either share it with Ryan to put into the chat, or I don't think we can put it in the chat directly, but that would be really helpful. And it is, just as an aside, we were a few of us were just talking this morning about this instance with Columbia, which we're looking into, where groups of journalists, including student journalists at the Columbia Journalism School, were basically kettled and herded away from the activities at the building that was being occupied by the protesters, and then essentially locked in another building and held there under police watch for, I think, at least an hour. We're looking into it to learn more. And other journalists were herded off of the campus. And in the end, there was a piece that we were looking at in New York Magazine, written by one of the student journalists, that she realized that there was either only one journalist or none actually able to see what was happening in the occupied building. And that's the kind of thing, the reality on the ground that Caitlin is referring to, and that Carlos experienced as well. There's another comment here, by the way. I'll just mention it in case you haven't seen it, and then I have a couple of thoughts or questions for the panel, and then we'll go right to the questions. Michael's, and welcome to all the people who are here. It's great to see you here. So many folks I know. Michael Zorn mentions Indiana is cracking down on the role of the Public Access Counselor's Office. And this may be something that we see state by state, and it's very hard to track, where the support that's provided to journalists seeking public documents is just diminished. So the act of actually getting a public record is slow walked. I mean, either because there's no staff or for other reasons. So thank you for that comment. I'm seeing some blog posts Caitlin's sharing, and I think, Ryan, you may have to amplify that to everyone. I'm not sure they're going to everyone unless you do so. Okay, I wanted to just do one thing, and this is actually for Carlos too. A question to you. There was a question from Megan Parker, who's long been a very important person in the environmental journalism field. She's now at the Wilson Center prior to running the SEJ. I also saw that the current executive director of SEJ, Aparna Mukherjee, was in the crowd. So welcome to both of you. But Megan asks specifically about the fact that the Press Freedom Tracker looks at US numbers, mentions that CPJ tracks incidents around the world, but doesn't include environment as a tag. So it's kind of hard to assess threats to environmental journalists. Two questions. One maybe to you, Carlos, which is, do we know of other efforts to systematically track press freedom violations by environment as a topic? Carlos, you may have some thoughts on the international front, and then I can share something about what the tracker does. Oh, you're
sorry,
muted.
my apologies.
There you go. You're good.
I don't know of anything similar to the CPJ and the US Press Freedom Tracker, but there was a recently released report in February, I believe, by the International Press Institute called Climate and Environmental Journalism Under Fire. And in that piece, they quote several environmental journalists, as well as several, they quote environmental and international journalists about the experiences that they have had reporting on environmental issues across the world. And a lot of those times they'll talk about either not being able to access certain areas where they need to do their reporting because of the dangers presented, right? We know that in many places, environmental journalists can't really go to a place without having some form of protection, whether it be by the group that controls that area, for lack of a better term, or because they've personally been threatened by people committing environmental crimes in that area. As it also notes that local journalists are kind of the ones best equipped to report on these stories, because they know the landscape that they live in. However, they face a lot of threats because, unlike me, for example, reporting in Atlanta or the Dominican Republic, they're not able to leave those places once their stories come out. So they have to stay in the area after their stories come out and face the consequences enacted upon them by whoever is making these dangers happen, right? I don't know if that answers the question or if
Yeah. No, I think that's really helpful, and we shared, Ryan has shared the link to that report. I also do know, by the way, that there's UNESCO. I think Megan is noting that it's going to be released tomorrow, which will have, it looks like, specific numbers on press freedom violations against environmental journalists globally. And thank you, Megan, for sharing that. There's some contact information in there as well as a link for a live stream. So that's really helpful. You're like a ghost panelist for us, Megan. That's really fantastic. And by the way, if anybody missed it, there was at the Wilson Center, Megan organized a great panel yesterday also on this topic with a global focus. And Megan, feel free to go ahead and add that link in for people to watch. I listened in, and there's a lot of great insights there. But yes, watch for the UNESCO report. And to the first part of that question, I'll just add that, so the question was about also the U.S. Press Freedom Tracker and how we handle the environment tag. We call it environmentalism, which reflects not what the journalists are doing, but what the subject of the story is doing. And I mentioned, well, we look for patterns, context that might help us better understand the data. So, and I mentioned a couple like protests, which is a huge number of incidents. I mentioned the Israel-Gaza war, which is a growing number. So with the environmentalism tag, our thought, has been there are some unique circumstances under which that particular topic is generating more press violations. I think and I've been with a tracker and FPF for just a year now, so this is an older history, but back in 2017, 2018, there were a lot of pipeline protests that environmental journalists were covering, and there were arrests and assaults on journalists in those situations. And I think at that time, it became clear that we needed to have a way to, categorize or to tag those. I will say, though, it's a little tricky for us. I'll give you an example, and we haven't quite figured this out. There may be more incidences in our database, and I invite anybody who looks through the database to flag us on this, that involve coverage of environmental stories that we haven't tagged that way. And I'll give you a very concrete example. Last year, last fall, there was a Chicago area reporter, Calumet City, a local reporter at the Daily Southtown, who was reaching out to town managers and officials to ask about how the city was dealing with infrastructure with extreme rain. So it's like heavy rain, and then there's floods, et cetera. And he was persistently asking about that to the extent to which, thank you for sharing that, that's helpful, Ryan, the town actually charged him with violating municipal ordinances just for asking the questions and being persistent. Now, we captured that as a violation, and a criminal charge, but we did not choose to tag it as environmental because our thought was, well, he could have been asking about anything and gotten that. Was it because it was an environmental issue? We thought, well, there's no clear way of knowing that. We just know that he was, charged with these violations, and it could have been about any other policy. So there may be more there. So I hope that answers the question. Sometimes it's very clear, like if coverage of an environmental protest, that's the most obvious one. Sometimes it's less clear. So thank you for that question. We've got a bunch of other questions in here. And by the way, keep them coming. And panelists, if you have thoughts about any of these questions, jump in as well. Let's see what we have here, though. Someone, this is an interesting question. So Joe Davis, who I know is also a fellow SE Journal editor and active in SEJ and FOIA issues for many years, asks, many environmental stories lie inside the fence line of an industrial facility, privately owned. Any tips on how to handle that kind of situation? And I presume in terms of access, to that, or any protections if the reporter is, faced with a violation, an assault, an attack, a threatened arrest, etc. Caitlin, maybe you have some insight into that?
Sure, I can start from the legal perspective, and then maybe one of our reporters can jump in with some more practical tips. But from a legal perspective, journalists don't have a First Amendment right to trespass on private property. So you can't just go on and claim the First Amendment. Unfortunately, it doesn't work that way.
Bummer.
That's true. Yeah. But
Um,
fence line is maybe the key word in there.
Sure. If you're reporting from outside on public property, you're on very solid First Amendment ground. Because again, there is a right to be present in public, just like anyone has a First Amendment right to do so. But I would just say be very aware, I guess, of where the property line is. And if you're told you are trespassing, you should move back onto public property. Journalists should also be aware of some states that have enacted laws specifically around drone filming of private property, which has come up in some environmental stories. So unfortunately, Texas's law has been upheld against a constitutional challenge brought by the National Press Photographers Association. And there are other states that have other laws. NPPA has a lot of great guidance on the drone laws that I would encourage folks to check out. So yeah, it is tough when it's private property. I guess I would say, and the reporters can talk more about this, try to find a source who can tell you about what's going on behind the closed doors, and you aren't going to be able to see from the outside.
Just a quick follow-up before we hear from Hallie or Carlos on this. Is I forget what it's called, but there's a status that this was applied or attempted to be applied to pipeline facilities where they were essentially labeled as secure facilities or high security facilities, so that it created a whole nother layer of protections against journalists reporting or capturing visual information. Is that something that anybody is aware has been, that status has been challenged, for instance, for pipelines, but maybe for other kinds of facilities like water treatment facilities or et cetera?
I'm not aware of challenges to those, but I would say that if the government is just kind of arbitrarily applying them, they would be very ripe to be challenged. Another thing we've seen happen, and I believe happened in Carlos's case, is police declaring entire areas as crime scenes and saying that everyone has to
Right.
vacate because it's a crime scene. And again, if police are not actually securing a perimeter and investigating and looking for clues, it really just seems like a pretext to try to exclude journalists. And so that's another problematic way that police have been trying to exclude reporters from covering things that really should be public.
That's really helpful. Yeah. Hallie, Carlos, do you have any thoughts about the fence line coverage concerns?
Honestly, the times where I've kind of been in this situation, my best advice is what Caitlin said: try to develop a source on the inside. I imagine Hallie has more to say about this, but FOIA requests, perhaps, depending on if a state or federal agency has to document what's going in there, there might be pictures of violations if that's kind of what you're investigating. Other than that, I mean, the times where I've been in the situation where I'm on private property reporting on this, I've just kind of taken the risk and been like, I can weather a criminal trespass charge. Thankfully, it's never happened, but that is not advice, to be clear. It's not me saying that you should do that. But yeah, it's what I've done and the decisions I've made.
Yeah, I agree with that, Carlos. I'd say, like, of course, first option that would be nice if it worked out is like asking, of course, the company if you can get a tour, if you can get inside, if they'll let you come take a look around with them. but that's increasingly seems to be a no-go, a non-starter with a lot of companies, unfortunately. I totally agree with like finding a source on the inside or finding a community member that lives very close to the plant that's probably going to want to talk about what they're seeing over there. That's usually who I'm talking to, or these fence line communities who are monitoring often. There are even, you know, sometimes the neighbors who are in Louisiana, a lot of our environmental enforcement relies on self-reported data from the industry. So sometimes there are also residents that just decide to take up citizen science and have like either monitors, air monitors attached to their houses, or cameras even to monitor flaring. So that can be a good option for you. And then, yeah, I totally agree, Carlos. There's FOIAs in Louisiana. We have like a big database of the reports that the industry does file. So that's always good fodder to be looking at. Making sure that you see if like a compliance order comes up, anything like that. Yeah, that's kind of what I do. It is always nerve-wracking, especially after, you know, an explosion at a chemical plant, or if there's smoke coming out and you're rushing to the scene. And a lot of times it is private property, but you still want to get the story. So I'm usually, and I agree, Carlos, this isn't advice. This is just what I do. I'm like inching up the road a little bit to see who might be willing to talk to me out of the emergency responders and the plant managers before someone comes, probably plant security comes and says, hey, you're not supposed to be here. Oh, okay, you're right. Okay, I'll just leave. So then you just be nice.
Mhm.
So asking forgiveness, not permission, as a standby. But yeah, I also really like the idea of, you know, the communities, the fence line communities, and reporting on the ground about what they're perceiving or tracking. By the way, someone's mentioned that the term that I was searching for a moment ago is critical infrastructure. That's Mickey Ostreicher. Thank you for that. Someone else had that as well. There are a few questions about international things, but before, since it's World Press Freedom Day, even though our focus is mostly domestic, let's definitely allow some time for that. But before I get to that, there is a one other question, and I wonder, this is for any or all of the panelists. Edib Corkett asks, how about providing a short list of all the legal protections to all the journalists to carry with them and show to law enforcement officers? And I want to just add to that question, like, is that really effective? I mean, it's like carrying, you know, here's the First Amendment, do you read it? So from a legal point of view, what would be useful to cite to a law enforcement officer, but from the on the ground perspective, what really is going to happen in this on the scene, at least what your experience, Carlos and Hallie, has been. But Caitlin, is there, is it worth carrying around like an embossed First Amendment or some other list of rules, or are you just going to get knocked down with a baton because of it?
Yeah, I'm a lawyer, so it pains me to say this, but I'm not sure it would be very effective to carry around something like that in the chaotic environment of a protest. I would say more important is to clearly identify yourself as press, both, if you can wear something that identifies yourself as press, and then if you are being arrested or detained or pushed back, to verbally identify yourself as press and make that extremely clear, to, as much as you can, comply with officers' directions while still gathering the news, and to try to urge them, if they are going to arrest you or something like that, to again say you are press, say that they should call a supervisor, say that they should call your newsroom, tell them that you don't agree to allow them to search your devices, and just using those kind of verbal reminders about the press, I think, would probably be more effective in a protest or arrest situation.
That's great. Very helpful. Hallie, Carlos, anything to add to that one?
I want to say, if you're interacting with an official not in a non-protest scenario, reading the laws is probably a good idea. In a protest scenario, yeah, being clearly identified is best. Saying you're a reporter if you're pushed back. Having somebody else to right, we always recommend the buddy system during protests. Having somebody else to record if you're being either attacked or arrested, that has you clearly saying I'm a member of the press, is probably a good idea. especially for the likely ensuing legal trial. If you should absolutely sue police and security forces for detaining you if you're a member of the press. That's kind of my best advice.
I just have like a quick question going off of that. Like, would it be helpful in the event that you get arrested? Like, could it be helpful at that point having that list to show them like, hey, you shouldn't have done this? Or do you guys think not really?
Mm.
After
I
the
can
fact.
try.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead,
Go
Caitlin.
ahead. You can try. Carlos, go ahead.
Oh, I was gonna say I've never been arrested, but I have talked to many journalists who have, and after the fact, when they're holding you, but you still haven't been charged, it might be a good idea, yeah, to know off the top of your head, because they might not let you bring out any documents or anything, or even opening your phone in that case is kind of a security issue, because if it's open, police are able to search it, at least in the United States, I believe. But knowing off the top of your head, citing the state, local, or federal laws that allow journalists to document might be a good idea once you've been arrested, but during the arrest is probably not gonna make a cop stop, or unless you say that you will threaten to sue them, that might make them stop. But yeah, after the fact, definitely a good idea to repeat the laws that govern press freedom.
And by the way, one comment in the chat is that, oh, and Caitlin, you may have something to add, sorry, there, but Mickey also notes that sometimes identifying yourself as press to police might actually make you a target of
Yeah.
protesters who don't necessarily want to have their identities captured or have other reasons to assault press. And we've seen a lot of that. We saw a lot of that during the 2020 protests, social justice protests as well. So that's a difficult reality. Even wearing a press jacket and not saying it can make you, or even positioning yourself in a spot at a protest where it's obvious that you're press. Which side of the line do you stand on? Tricky situations. There is one question, and since this is a lot of what we do at FPF, there's a question about, which is kind of an international question. The speaker doesn't provide their name, but they say, I occasionally work on digital security with journalists who are outside the US, Central and South America, Asia, Africa, and very curious which lessons learned you would say are most applicable to journalists and journalism security consultants, he adds, or she, across the world. Thanks. So from a security point of view, Caitlin, you referred to protecting sources through legal means. I know I'm not the expert at FPF. There's a digital security training team that has a lot, and we have a lot of information on the site about this, but protecting sources digitally. So protecting your material, protecting your correspondence. FPF provides this secure drop system, which allows whistleblowers to share information with journalists that is wiped clean of any digital signatures, so it can't be traced back to them. And Ryan is sharing some links there, it looks like, as well, on safe reporting in the field. Anybody else have any direct experience with digital security for your work? I'm not sure that that's come up with Carlos. Yeah,
I feel like I've talked a lot, but sorry. I
please.
just
No,
wanted to
go ahead.
say, right, a lot of the sources that I've talked to in Latin America specifically, and I know this is a thing for other places as well, but they use WhatsApp a lot, and I use WhatsApp pretty much every day. And while it is end-to-end encrypted, it is owned by Facebook. So keep that in mind if you're using WhatsApp. Perhaps the better messaging app. No messaging app is going to be completely safe. Perhaps the better messaging app is either Signal or Proton Mail, and those, I'm sure other people could talk to the strengths and weaknesses of those systems. But I just think it's something to keep in mind, especially for the way that WhatsApp has kind of become ubiquitous in a lot of Latin America and the Caribbean.
That's really helpful. And we do have some training and background material on WhatsApp and I think Signal particularly because of some advantages there in security. We have just a couple of minutes before we wrap up. So let me just ask very quickly. And there are other questions. I'm afraid we're not going to get to all of them, but just to ask the panelists in general, what you think is the most important step that either you or the journalism profession can take going forward to address some of these issues that you've brought up. You know, if you had to sort of focus in on either a set of practices or you know, a policy or anything else that you want to just share in the few minutes remaining. So why don't I start in the reverse order? I'll start with Caitlin. You were the last to present, and then I'll go to Hallie and back to Carlos.
Sure, I just encourage journalists to speak up when your rights are threatened. And sometimes reporters are reluctant to make themselves the story, and that's understandable. But press freedom violations are violations of everyone's freedom. And so it's not just you who's the story when your First Amendment rights are violated, it's the whole community. So please speak up about these incidences, contact the tracker, write about it yourself, make everyone aware so we can track how environmental journalists are being targeted and facing threats to their press freedom.
That's great. Thank you. Hallie?
Caitlin said it so well, especially since my experience is more with public records, but just because of this attack that we're going through right now in Louisiana, when it comes to access, I think, like Caitlin said, now more than ever is the time for all of the journalism groups to get together and make sure that we're making a point about this. And I just wanted to give a little plug, shout out for SEJ's Freedom of Information Task Force that's led by Tim Wheeler over at the Chesapeake Bay Journal. And I know they issued a big statement about the reporters that have been killed over in Gaza. And I think that they are always looking for ways to get involved and help advocate for reporters, especially environmental journalists. So if you ever have anything that you want to bring to their attention, please feel free to get in contact with me or our executive director, Aparna, who I saw in the chat earlier.
Yeah. That's great. And there's a tip line I think that Ryan just posted for the Press Freedom Tracker. So if you are a victim of a press violation, yes, speak up, let people know. Carlos, last thoughts.
Kind of echoing what Caitlin and Hallie said, journalists and journalist groups providing a united front against violations of press freedom in every situation, speaking up, and also supporting local journalism wherever you're at, right? A robust local journalism outlet with the necessary resources to report on not only violations of press freedom, but report on environmental issues wherever they're at, is likely the best thing to fight back against violations of press freedom and kind of environmental crimes or report on environmental crimes or anything of that nature. And kind of very quickly, I wanted to plug two groups that have done great local journalism work in Atlanta, the Atlanta Community Press Collective, which has done amazing work, and the Xylem, which is also, I don't know if that's how you say it, but it's with an X. If those two groups have done great work around Stop Cop City and other Atlanta issues. Yeah,
That's awesome. Well, I would like to, before we wrap up, just say another thank you to our three great panelists, to Caitlin, Carlos, and Hallie. And I'd also like to note that, you know, we have a recording. We'll share that link. There's also a ton of great information. Thank you to all of the those who attended and those who shared in the chat and in the questions. There are just a million great links in there. We're going to actually leave the webinar open for a moment in case you want to look through or a snapshot some of the links and references, but really appreciate those contributions to the folks in the chat. And also thank you to my colleague, Ryan, for doing such a great job managing the webinar and showing, you know, the images and also, you know, populating the chat with more great information. So, watch, I think we'll also have a follow-up email, both SEJ and FPF, with link information to the video and resources. So watch for that. And thank you all very much. Be safe, but shout out, and let the world know if something's gone wrong, so you can tap into this great community. Thank you all, and have a great rest of the day. We'll leave the webinar open for a minute so you can look at the chat, but take care. Thanks all.
Can we
Thank
take
you
a
so
quick
much.
screenshot?
Yeah, please take a screenshot, and then the recording, you could also screenshot from the recording later on too, but absolutely.
Awesome. If everyone could just say cheese.
Please.
That looks so
You
good.
got it.
Okay, thank you guys.
Beautiful. All right. Okay. Take care all. Bye.
Thank y'all. Have a good day.
Be well. Bye, Carlos.